Hello, everybody. Here's Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm again joined by my countryman, Jacques Baud, a former Swiss intelligence officer and Swiss Army colonel. Jacques, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me again. And thank you. I take the opportunity to thank you for everything you have done in favor of my case, the interviews you have done, all the people who have expressed their view on your channel. I think this is extremely useful. It was also useful for me to understand my case.
Yeah, and I just need to say, because I didn't put it into the introduction, you are currently sanctioned by the European Union, although you yourself are also living in the European, actually in the belly of the beast in Belgium. And you, since December 15th, you are under these draconian measures where all of your money is frozen. You're not allowed to travel. You're not allowed to leave Belgium. You are not allowed to buy food. You're not allowed to buy anything. You're not allowed, nobody's allowed to have transactions with you. It's a pretty insane situation, isn't it? Can you just describe it a little bit for people who haven't heard about it, although I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard of the case by now?
I think by now, as you said, a lot of people know that worldwide. But in any case, so I was applied sanctions on the 15th of December, as you rightly said. I was not informed beforehand, so I was taken by surprise on the 15th of December. This is a political decision. This is not a judicial decision, meaning that I have never been in front of a court. I have never breached any law. I have never been accused to breach any law. I had not the opportunity, hence, to defend myself. I had not the opportunity to be defended or represented by a lawyer. I had not the opportunity to expose or to defend or present my case. I was not even presented to the case so far. This is a unilateral decision of the privation of my freedom of movement, obviously, my freedom of, I would even say, freedom of living, because, as you rightly said, the sanctions have frozen my accounts in the EU, meaning that I cannot pay anything. I cannot pay my bills. I cannot buy food. I cannot buy, I don't know, gas for my car or whatever. I'm totally, since the 15th of December, I'm living out of the generosity of my neighbors, of the solidarity of people here in Brussels. I received a lot of requests for help. I mean, people wanting to help me within the European Union, in France, in Netherlands, in Germany, in Switzerland, of course, and so on. But so far, I'm living on the generosity of people living in my neighborhood,
And
meaning that the EU, without any due process, have in fact removed my fundamental freedoms, and including freedom of speech, by the way. This is yes, this is something quite odd, because, as you probably know, I'm expert of the rule of law for the UN. and, and
you worked for the UN, several UN bodies. You also worked as an advisor to NATO. You are one of the...
In the last 20 years of my life, I have worked for international institutions. I've worked for the UN, obviously, in peacekeeping operations mainly, but also for reform of institutions. For instance, in Ukraine, I was there as an expert for reform of this institution. I've worked for the African Union in Nairobi, and my last position was advisor in the yes, we can say advisor to the NATO. I was responsible for the fight against proliferation of small arms within NATO, and in that capacity, I was also made, let's say, acquainted with the conflict in Ukraine, because that was precisely when in 2014, when the conflict really started in Ukraine. So this is my background. Before that, I used to be strategic analysis officer in the Swiss intelligence. That's a long time ago. Where I was in charge of the Warsaw Pact. So not just the Soviet Union, but also all the Eastern European countries. And this is more or less my in a nutshell my background. I have extensive experience of mediation in conflicts, and that's important to understand because I have mediated several conflicts in Africa where precisely when you do mediation, you cannot be a party of the conflict. I mean, you have to understand the position of both parties, and you cannot, as a mediator, uh, show that you are in favor of the party A or party B. You have to be impartial. Impartial means with no party. And that's exactly my professional experience. And I have mediated in different conflict. I in that capacity, I was able to help or even to free hostages just by talking to the parties in a very similar way as ICRC does on several occasions. So you don't take position, you just analyze, you understand the position of both parties, and that helps you then to solve the issue. And that's exactly the same position I have with any other conflict. It may be in Palestine, Venezuela, or in Ukraine. So I have absolutely no party. I never uh, said in any way that I was in favor of the victory of party A or party B or the defeat of party A or party B. This is not my mantra. I mean, I am an analyst and I try to understand how both party thinks in the conflict. This is the whole idea. So it's important probably to understand that in order to understand how the sanctions that tell, in fact, the text of the sanction says that I'm a mouthpiece for Russia, and I cannot understand that because I never tried even to do that. I refused. I refused or declined invitations from Russian media to appear in those media. It may happen that some of my interviews were picked by Russian media and taken. That's possible, but I have never. I refused to be directly interviewed in media in order to avoid precisely to have my work understood as propaganda.
Yeah.
And if you read my books, for instance, because I have wrote several books about the conflict, I mean the various conflicts, but in particular the one in Ukraine, I avoid any, for instance, language that is usually related to propaganda, such as Banderite or Ukro-Nazi or something like that. I explain the distinction between Nazi and neo-Nazi. I don't use the word Nazi to describe, for instance, the
The ultra-nationalistic
Ukrainian government, for instance. I never did that. And I explained why I don't do that and why I don't want to do that. So I made every effort not to be a propagandist. And that also probably tells something about the sanctions, because despite all the efforts to be neutral, to be impartial, you are still considered as a propagandist.
and
And that tells something.
so that's just one layer. The other layer, though, is that even if you did that, even if you did propaganda, even if you repeated it, it would still not break a law in the European Union. That would still be legal. It would still be covered by the freedom of expression. And actually, that's exactly why you're being sanctioned and why they are not sending the police to arrest you, because you didn't break any laws. The European Union even says sanctions are not punishment. They say so. Sanctions are an extra legal mechanism to destroy somebody's life. And they're extra legal because they're not illegal. They're actually within the competence of the EU Council, but they circumvent all and any legal protections that you usually have, which is why they tell you have to go to the European Court and get them back. At best, you take them back, but they took them away, even circumventing the legal protections that you should have in Belgium.
Sorry to interrupt you. You're absolutely right with that. Fully agree, and you have explained that, by the way, extremely well in previous some videos that you've done, and that's a very interesting. But there is an additional sub-layer, if you want, to that, because as you know, this decision, of the sanctions, was taken by the Council of Foreign Ministers of the EU. In essence, these sanctions are in fact a foreign policy measure.
Yes.
But I'm living within the EU.
Yes.
And here you see the contradiction. And it's very interesting, because we are moving towards a situation which is not very far away from efforts that you had in the US just after the 9/11 with the Patriot Act, for instance, that blurs the limits between foreign policy or foreign action and domestic action in the security area. And here we are in a very similar situation, although I have no security, fundamentally no, I breach and not a single law regarding security. But the EU is using foreign policy tools to sanction someone who is inside the EU. And that's quite unique as far as I know. There are other cases of people who have been sanctioned also for the issues related to the freedom of speech, freedom of press, or things like that. I'm not aware of all the cases. My knowledge, and I may be wrong on that, but that most of them live outside of the EU, meaning that, of course, this is still the issue, as you rightly said, of an issue of the freedom of speech and freedom of opinion and all that. Basically, it's the same human rights issue. But in addition to that, I have the problem and that's an institutional problem within the EU, that you use foreign policy measure to address domestic policy issues. And that's a new layer in that. I understand that there's some explanation for using the sanctions, but again, these sanctions are meant to sanction people who are living outside of the EU. I mean, I think in the list where I am, the list of the 15th of December, there are about 60 entities or person in this list. I think I'm the only one who lives in the EU. Most of them are living outside of the EU. Sorry, yes.
There's one, actually, the case before you, and his name is Hüseyin Doğru. And he's a German citizen living in Germany who was sanctioned in late 2024 or early 2025 under the same sanctions regime, because the EU actually has 3 sanctions regimes, but this is the Russia sanction regime. And he, since over a year now, is under sanctions in Germany. The outrageous thing with him is that on the sanctions list, his nationality is listed as Turkish. But he told me in an interview, no, I'm not Turkish. I don't have Turkish nationality. I'm German and German only. But they still list him as Turkish.
That's an interesting thing, because in my case, again, I cannot judge his case, but that points towards a decision-making which is quite fuzzy. Because in my case, I'm not sure people realize, I don't consider myself as the main target of my own sanction. I think, again, I don't know exactly what is the process, but according to some information I have, I was put on the sanction list by the French government. My personal interpretation, and again, that's my personal interpretation, I have no real proof to say that, but my view is that the target of the French government was in fact Xavier Moreau, who is a French citizen, who is living in Russia, who has also an activity on RT, for instance, and things like that. So this is probably the real target of the French government, but that would be the first time that the French government targets its own citizens. And my personal, again, that's my interpretation. I may be wrong on that, but my interpretation is that the French government didn't want to be to show that they were targeting a French citizen. They wanted to broaden a little bit the scope, and therefore they took me as as I mean, I consider myself as a collateral damage of this, even if, in fact, I'm more impacted than Xavier Moreau because he's living in Moscow. But I still consider that, again, with all reservation, because I don't know for sure. But that's my personal interpretation. The next question is that, according to my lawyers, the French government has most probably, I mean, certainly, talked to the Swiss government before, and the Swiss government didn't react to this.
Yeah.
And that's poses another question. But we are
No, it's a horrific situation, and I could never imagine that that Switzerland would just do nothing about one of its own citizens. But there we are, and I collected over 350 signatures within 3 or 4 days of like academics, journalists, former diplomats, send it to our foreign ministry, and until now all I got is an automatic response: we received your communication, and nothing ever since the December 19 or 20 or something like that. I mean, there's nothing. Is not the official Switzerland does nothing, and the European Union is the one that officially takes away even most fundamental human rights. My interpretation is that it's actually a process of like trying out how far one can go, because they've now sanctioned EU citizens. They've sanctioned Russian citizens in Russia. They've sanctioned EU citizens in Russia. They've sanctioned Swiss citizens in Switzerland, Nathalie Yamp. They now sanctioned a Swiss citizen in the EU. It's like kind of a probing exercise of what can happen.
That might be the case. Again, I mean, the process you describe points towards this. Myself, I have no real opinion about this. It might be that or not. I don't know. The thing is that we see more and more that, as I told you, I'm an expert on the rule of law.
Yes.
When you talk about the rule of law, the expression is telling. I mean, it's the rule of law. But we are in a case which is not ruled by law. It's ruled by policy. And you see that in modern states, since the 18th century, we tend to have a governance defined by law and the rule of law. And here we are in a situation where policy supersedes the law.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's interesting that we have several cases in those days. I mean, I mean, I don't want to expand on the case of Mr. Maduro, but we are exactly in the same situation, that policy supersedes law and international law in that case.
Yeah.
But and that's, I think it's a very dangerous a very dangerous situation, not just situation, but trend, in
Yeah.
fact, because we see that more and more we tend to make decisions. First of all, we take decision without paying attention to facts.
Yeah.
And since we make bad decisions, then we need to protect those bad decisions by telling people that they are doing propaganda where they are against those decisions.
Uh,
It's a vicious circle that we are engaging, and we have seen that. I mean, fundamentally, it is a very old thing. You can, in my book on governing by fake news, I'm mentioning all the cases that we had since the end of World War II, basically. But this situation has, I would say, accelerated to some extent after the 9/11.
Yeah.
where we had the feeling that security was the concern that should supersede any kind of law.
Do you
And you have the case of Guantanamo, and you have all these cases where, in fact, you disregard law in order to favor policy. Sorry, yes.
No, you're absolutely right. It's just I wanted to point out that another guest on my show once made a very, very important observation that the United States has been moving, and it seems the EU is now following from a model of the rule of law, in which there's an equal law for everybody, to rule by law, in which you yield law as a hammer against those you don't like, but not against the ones you like. You do it extremely selectively. And in a sense, what the EU is doing with the sanctions is exactly one of those moments. It makes the whole situation worse because there's no defined process when somebody's being sanctioned, right? Again, because it's not illegal. What you're doing is not illegal. Therefore, they get to pick and choose whoever they want to target. And what makes it even worse is that they can use anything as a justification. And I don't know what your lawyers told you, and maybe you can tell us how you are planning to appeal to that. But since this is ultimately a political decision, the Sandra Hofer, who I talked to on my channel, she told me that the European Court of Justice will only look at whether the accusation in the sanctions database is factual or not. If they can find that it's factual, then they stand, even if what you did is not illegal. But if you can prove that it is not factual, they will strike it down. But then the EU can simply change the definition and accuse you of something else, and then you're back on the list. And we have cases against Russians where the ECJ said, no, this is not true, take them down. They did, and then immediately put them back on with a different accusation. Are your lawyers, are you working on this problem?
Yes, absolutely. We are aware of that. I don't want to discuss the specifics of that because that's part of the strategy we'll use to go against the case. But in essence, you're absolutely right, and my lawyers are absolutely aware of that. They are experienced, and they have already dealt issues with sanctions, especially the Russian sanctions, which have their own specificity. And everybody, I mean, the people I've talked to are fully aware of that. The the thing is that what you just said before is in fact something that doesn't really speak to people, but it's a reality, and I know you're aware of that. We have transitioned from the international law-based order to the rules-based order.
Yes.
And that's exactly the difference, because law is law. This is written, law is given. I mean, you
And
cannot.
defined.
It's defined, it's clear. I mean, you have text, you have, it might be complex, it might be difficult, but you have something. Rules, however, are not written. They can be interpretations of law. They can be interpreted. They can be policies. They can be things like that. And if we just talk about Switzerland, for instance, I was surprised to see, if you read the reports on our national security policy, for instance, I was surprised to see that if you read those reports that we have annually, both on the security of Switzerland, the report of the strategic intelligence, and the report of the security policy, we don't mention law-based international order at all. Since about 10 years, we have shifted in the documents to international rules-based order. And in the case of Switzerland, again, I cannot speak about other countries, but in Switzerland, I'm not aware of any debate on this question at public level.
No.
I mean, the change from international law-based order and the compliance to international law-based order to compliance to rules-based order, this discussion has never occurred. I have worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for several years before I was in the sent abroad in my various missions, although I was still member of the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by the way. But nevertheless, um, I never heard about any a debate on this, even within the ministry, meaning that we have shifted an essential into an essential part of our foreign policy without really public knowledge. So it's a silent change of policy that nobody noticed really. And today the word rule based order is international rule based order is accepted. So we are, and I think this is an evolution we have seen everywhere. The US was the one who promoted this shift in policies, and today it's everywhere. And if you look at the public documents or things like that in various ministries around Europe, we will see that now it's a rule-based order, and we are exactly that. In my case, we are. It's not a case that is defined by law; it's defined by rules. Period.
Yeah, but exactly. And the rules are made arbitrarily. That's the point.
Exactly.
It's like
Yeah.
they
Yeah,
come
exactly. Yes,
as
absolutely.
they
Yeah.
go, as they
Yeah.
make them up, they pull them out
Exactly.
of their noses. But
Exactly.
the question really is, what do we do against this? Because the European Union now managed to create a process where, under the Lisbon Treaty, it is within its legal rights to create a regime that allows them to circumvent even the most basic of human rights protections of the member states. I mean, that's what's so horrible about this. And you're one of the first, not the, but one of the first cases in point, and one where it gets very glaring, right? Very, very kind of obvious that this is now a regime.
Oh, we have, I mean, as a Swiss, I have a small advantage in the sense that as of today, Switzerland is not member of the EU. As you may know, there are discussions to have some treaties to get closer cooperation with the EU. But interestingly enough, my case now in the Switzerland has become a case in point for people who oppose any relationship with or any development or any further development with the relationship between Switzerland and the EU. So meaning that I have a slight advantage towards those who are already in countries that belong to the EU, that now we have in Switzerland people reacting to that, understanding the danger of being closer to the EU. And that is something that probably the government starts to be aware of as of today, and probably that may prompt the government to take action, because this has a disastrous effect on the opinion of the Swiss population. But nevertheless, you are completely right. These are fundamental issues that we have seen a progressive shift in policies, or give more weight to policies, the word right, or law. And this is something that, as of today, nobody really noticed, because everybody understands that Russia is bad. Everybody understands that. But we may find a case, and probably a good case might be Denmark with the Greenland, where you start to understand that where do you stand then? And what is then your position? And because these are cases today we have kind of a unanimity, wrong or bad, but we have a very strange situation, by the way, towards the conflict in Ukraine. But this is another question. In any case, there is a kind of consensus that Russia is bad, and therefore everybody says, well, if you say something that looks like in favor of Russia, then you are pro-Russian. Period. But now think about it. If you say something that is in favor of the US towards Denmark or things like that, how
Of
can
course.
you be treated? And you see, we will have more case. I mean, I don't know how long the conflict in Ukraine will last. We'll see that. But there might be something after that. And this after that, people who are today in the mainstream might suddenly be out of the mainstream for some reason. and then they can be attacked by the same rules.
Of course, that's why we don't want an arbitrary system of punishment, because we want a systematic one so that we know how to structure society. That it's quite simple. I want to ask you though, and this goes deep. This goes deep to your expertise. So sanctions are a measure, a so-called measure of it's what's the word that I'm looking for? A sovereign right. Within the EU, or every country in the world, although the EU is not a country, but it has the rights due to the treaty, it has the right to restrict business on its territory, which is basically what it does. So does the US when it puts sanctions, but under international law, these are considered coercive measures. And if I am not mistaken, then the UN Charter says that actually only the Security Council has the right to take coercive measures, because they're considered, semi-acts of war, or is considered international violence, and only the Security Council is supposed to do those. Now, the US has been using sanctions forever. The EU has been using sanctions also for a long time, but other countries don't do that very much. I mean, is this sanctions themselves under international law, unilateral sanctions from states, how are they regarded?
Well, that's very interesting, and we are here in a kind of a gray zone, because obviously the U.S. has created a precedent with the unilateral sanctions. Institutionally, as you rightly said, the UN Security Council is the only one, in theory, who should be allowed to take sanctions against a member of the United Nations. For some reason, I mean, if you look at the charter, this is the for instance, there are many justifications for that. The one I use usually is that the UN Charter defines that you cannot interfere with domestic affairs of countries. And sanctions are essentially something to influence domestic affairs of countries, meaning that since the UN established the rules, it is also entitled to breach the rule, if I put it extremely simply. This is a very simplified view on that. And that's the reason why the UN Security Council has this ability. The US, because it's more powerful, but that's the law of the strongest, period. The US has done that. EU does it. But if you look at Switzerland, for instance, very interesting. If you look, for instance, at the sanctions taken against Russia, I published that in my book, by the way, in my books. If you look the number of sanctions, obviously the US has the most sanctions against Russia. But the second, and that's the status of early December last year, the second country that sanctions the most Russia is Switzerland, before the EU. So it's not that Switzerland is taking over EU sanctions. I mean, they probably do some, but they even sanction more. So they have their own sanctions.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting point, because Switzerland obviously is not a superpower. It may do that probably because it fears reaction from its powerful neighbors. Obviously, Switzerland is within enclosed within the European Union, so it may also have consequences if it is not proactive on some policies. Probably that was certainly the case with the US. And the issue of sanctions is not new. This is something that was addressed already in the 80s with those African leaders or dictators or whoever. And Switzerland was at the very beginning very reluctant to take sanctions or to sanction their belongings or things like that. But of course, there was the pressure of the US, who said, well, if you don't take measure against this country, we'll block the functioning of some Swiss banks in the US.
Yeah.
So we are here, and the problem here with this situation is that, again, we have shifted from international law into something that is kind of mafia-like a type of international relations based on the use of force, on coercion, and on blackmailing, basically.
Yeah.
And that's something which is extremely concerning, but it's an evolution which is not exactly new. It becomes more and more apparent, but this is something we had since about 30 years.
Yeah. When I talked to our compatriot Natalie Yamb, who currently, when the sanctions, she's Swiss, but when she was sanctioned, she was actually in an African country, so she is also not able to go back to Switzerland because, well, it's an island, and it's forbidden to fly over EU territory for sanctioned people. She told me, because she's been an activist for African cause since she's half Cameroonian. That these are the same measures that have been used against African activists for the past 70 years. So she said, we are not strangers to this kind of treatment, but the treatment is now extended to people inside the EU, people inside Switzerland. It's kind of the colonial process coming now after after members at home. So, and that's what makes it so scary, this foreign policy that's being turned inward. Wouldn't we need to, I mean, obviously we cannot do that, but once we're done with this and once we've taken the lessons, wouldn't we have to take the lesson that no, sanctions in general are an unlawful way of interacting with other people?
And I cannot talk about Mrs. Yamb case because I don't know exactly the case, first of all, and I cannot also talk about those activists that have been sanctioned before. To be honest, I was not aware of sanctions on them. But again, this is because it's not because they don't exist. It's simply because I was not aware of that, and that's a reason why I don't want to talk about things that I don't know. But what is obviously strange is that people who have not breached any law
Yeah.
can be put on a sanction list by EU members of countries who are not their own citizens. I mean, I understand that I could understand that you sanction people of your own country. I mean, they breach the law, they are a threat for your own security, and you can even probably address people who are outside of your country because they are a threat to your security, terrorists, for instance. I can understand that. The problem is that here we are talking about a country, because if Mrs. Yamb, as in my case, was put on a sanctioned list, didn't come from Switzerland. This came from a EU country. So this country, assuming it's France, for instance, was this country threatened physically? I mean, was these individuals real security threats? I mean, you can document a terrorist or something like that, but someone who just advocates a situation, and again, in my case, I'm not advocating any cause. I'm not considering myself as an activist. But again, regardless, freedom of speech applies to everybody equally. The thing is that if you are not a direct threat to the country, how come can a foreign country accusing you? I mean, we are talking about France. It could be the U.S. The U.S. decide I'm a terrorist. I will decide I'm an activist, or decide I cannot speak, or decide. You see, we can even I smiled when it happened to Thierry Breton. But this is the same case. You see, we have the U.S. Applying sanctions on people around the globe and entities. I mean, it can be companies, it can be whoever, without even needing to document that. Because at the end of the day, uh, in my case, it's obvious, but for all those who are on sanctioned list, they can be put on the list just like this. I mean, nobody needs to demonstrate. And if you just take the case of Maduro, for instance, he was the rationale for attacking Maduro was he was the head of a cartel, a drug cartel. And today we learned that this cartel doesn't exist. And the Department of Justice just dropped the accusation. So meaning that we are here in something which is exactly what you said before, is totally arbitrary. We can define the threat arbitrarily. We don't even have to demonstrate that it really exists.
It's even worse. I mean, it doesn't even legally need to be a threat. If they want, they can put your name on the list accusing you of being as older than 60-year-old male Swiss in Brussels. And that would stand. That would stand if you would still be on the list. I mean, because it's equally illegal to be a 60 older than 60 in Brussels as it is illegal to analyze the Russian and Ukrainian positions. I'm not even kidding. It sounds ridiculous, but that's what it is. It's pure arbitrary punishment for, I don't like your face. You're going to be punished.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But the thing is, I think, of course, this is something I could live without sanctions, to be honest. But if we look at it critically and with some distance, everybody who has some knowledge of the case understands that regardless of how you think about whoever, Russia, Ukraine, whoever, everybody understands that it's unjustified. I mean, there have been a couple of Swiss journalists who found that justified, but
did you read that horrible article in the Swiss Officers Association?
I've read this article, but again, here this is so poorly documented that I'm not sure that the guy has gained anything on that. And that's the same with the European Union, by the way, because at the end, since everybody understands that it's unjustified, I mean, a lot of people have followed my interviews on various channels. They said, how come can we punish someone for something he never said?
And even if he did say it, it would still not be illegal. It's like, I mean, it's just what it creates is a space in which people debate whether or not you deserve it because you're a traitor or you work for the Russians. They start this, it's this lynch mob mentality that it actually feeds.
It's true, but in addition to that, I mean, this has two aspects. And there is a very interesting small video that was done by the Université Populaire Protestante. It's David Nadeau. He's a guy living in south of France. Has done a very, very nice video, very short one about my case. But apparently he's following me. I didn't know him, but apparently he's following. And he said, well, the problem here is that Jacques Baud never said what he's accused of. But we allege, it's not, we don't even allege. We allege he said something. So it's not even something that happened.
We assume.
It's an allegation on something, on an intention. They are attributing to me intentions. So it's not just that you didn't say what you said, but they interpret what you said in a way that you never meant it. So we are here in something that goes beyond even the freedom of speech and freedom of opinion, because there it's definitely opinion manipulation. And that's quite interesting. Again, I didn't know this person, but he apparently followed me. He knew, he told in his video, he said he's not always agreeing with me and all that. But at the same time, he said Jacques Baud never said what he is accused of. So we are in something that goes well beyond you cannot even burn my books, you understand, because at the end, this is not my books that are a problem, but is what you could interpret from the reading of the book. So it goes it goes very further away from even the book themselves. So we are really engaging in a kind of let's say in an area where we have never been, or probably we did so in the Soviet Union, probably. And in fact, the process we have when security, or let's say uh, prevention of security issues supersedes law, you're exactly in the case of the Soviet Union, where just as a reminder, but also an explainer, KGB was both responsible for external security and domestic policy. So you had this transition, a seamless transition between foreign policy measures and domestic policy measures. And we are exactly in the same pattern today with the European Union. And that is exactly where we are heading to. And I find that extremely concerning.
Yeah.
And I'm not the only one, because I have been contacted by a lot of European parliamentarians. Apparently, this has not raised so much, let's say, interest within the European Parliament, but some parliamentarians are very concerned about this evolution because, as I said, today it's fine because everybody is against Russia and Russia. But tomorrow it may be something else, and the rules we can apply the same rules for anyone. Yeah. This is the question.
It is
Sorry.
it is probably most likely part of Europe's war psychosis that now you see the enemy from without and the enemy from within, and you have to use terrible measures against both of them. It's very, very scary if that's indeed what it is, because this will get worse.
Oh, if you look on the timeline, you could say that this didn't happen 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Yes.
It happens today. And it happens today at a point where obviously we see that the European, or not just the European, but let's say the Western narrative is crumbling. And that's probably also an indication. It's fascinating to see that nobody cared about what you said in 2022, because everybody was convinced by the European narrative that Russia would be defeated.
Yeah.
But today, and as the Belgian Prime Minister said recently, as there was all this discussion with Russian assets and things like that, he said, well, if you think that Russia will be defeated, there's an illusion. Now, exactly at this point, people understand that the narrative is crumbling, and therefore the narrative requires more protection. And that's exactly where we are heading towards something which is probably going to worsen.
I wonder though what it tells us about the way that our states in the West are made. Because, in theory, there would be a completely normal legal way of achieving what they achieved with you. And that would be to criminalize the act, right? Let's make a law, run it through the European Parliament, run it through the national parliaments, that criminalizes propaganda, right? You could do that. But that would be a long, drawn-out process, and it would raise a lot of red flags left and right? Because it would run into obvious problems with freedom of speech. So instead of doing that, which would be the normal way, you just go the foreign policy way, which is much easier, much more direct, right? But what does that tell you something about the way that the states are created at the moment, and maybe also the avenues available to strike back against this bestiality?
Well, I think if you start questioning the way our states function, I mean, this is an endless discussion. My books, in fact, are not about whether it's Russia who wins or Ukraine or whoever. My books are about the way we make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
This is the topic of my books. This is the way we make decisions. And we see that one day you see people are telling you that Russia is taking microchips from wash machine to put in missile. They don't have missiles anymore. They have only for 3 months of ammunition and whatever. And 3 weeks later, they tell you that Russia is about to attack Paris, and the chief of staff is concerned because France might be attacked within a couple of years. And so this is the whole issue. What is the credibility of our states? Again, I am a Cold Warrior. I mean, we experienced the situation we had during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Pravda was not forbidden. You see, you could buy the Pravda in a papers outlet, news outlets. It was not forbidden. We didn't even forbid the Communist Party. I mean, the French Communist Party, as an example, was very much related to the Soviet Communist Party, but it was not forbidden. Probably people were monitored, and there were probably more surveillance about that. That's certainly that, but it was not forbidden. And the reason why we didn't had to go through censorship or to restrict the freedom of speech or freedom of opinion is because we were confident that we had the best system, that we were confident that our system would prevail, and we were confident that regardless of how the Soviet propaganda would work, our narrative will always be better. And therefore, you don't need a censorship. You have a kind of a informational Darwinism, if you want. The problem is that when you start to engage in censorship, in sanctions against individuals, to prohibit speech, and to forbid people to publish or whatever, or even forbid Russian media, for instance, this means that you're not confident with your own system. That means that your own decision making is not based on facts, that you cannot justify what you're saying, and therefore your own policies, your own speech, your own governance is fragile because it's not set on solid basis, on facts and things like this. In fact, what we are seeing here is the example of essential weakness. The values that we have in Europe, the values of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of opinion, freedom of press, and you can name it. They are strong because we are strong. We are not strong because of the value. The values are strong because we are strong. See, and this the fact that we tend to disregard, we feel ourselves weak, and therefore we need to establish barriers. We have to. This is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And in order the dictatorship before, because they felt that the system was essentially weak.
Yeah.
And therefore, you need to protect it.
Yeah.
And you need to have additional protection. You need to have additional barriers. You need to channel the freedom of speech and the freedom of thinking and opinion and things like that, because you feel that there is an inherent vulnerability. So that's exactly what we are witnessing today. I mean, in the past 3 years, regardless of what you have in Ukraine, obviously you have a lot of bad decisions that have been taken, and we see that Europe has weakened essentially economically in various on various levels. And that's, in fact, demonstrates the weakness of the governance, and therefore the governance has to protect itself. And that's how I see it. So therefore, I'm not sure these sanctions are beneficial to the EU if you look with some distance. In fact, it affects the credibility of the whole system. And you see that in individual countries. I mean, you mentioned the case of Germany. Germany was one of the first country to sanction its own citizens. I mean, Germany as a country, not as EU, but Germany. I think it was Miss Lipp, who used to be a journalist working in the Donbass, and she was sanctioned. She's a German citizen. Now she's living in Russia, I assume. I don't know exactly. I'm not following her. But in any case, that means that when you start to sanction your own citizens, that means that something is wrong in your system,
Yeah.
because otherwise you wouldn't need that.
And then
The truth would be enough.
and then instead of the system renovating itself and fixing its shortcomings, it actually then encrusts and only atrophies even more. But Jacques, what should we do? What's your advice to people at home who sit in frustration and think like, I wish there was something I could do?
Well, first of all, I think Alexandra
Hofer.
I think, said, and many others say the same thing. Basically, this battle will not be won at legal level, but will have to be won at political level.
Yeah.
In the European Union, people understand that my case is the tip of the iceberg and could be a precedent for other issues, and therefore I know several, and that will start because obviously we had the holidays, but now the the whole system is
Waking up.
weakening, and therefore we will have more action. But people realize that my case should be taken as an example to avoid a precedent. And that's certainly this political struggle will start. I receive a lot of messages from all over Europe. I would say all over the world, in fact, of people who are very concerned, but especially within Europe. And because, of course, people from the EU are directly affected by such a decision in reality. So we will have political action on that. And I don't know exactly what the Swiss government wants to do, and if he wants to do something. By the way, I have absolutely no indication of that. I tried to get in touch with the embassy in Brussels already on the 12th of December, as I received the first indication that I would be on the list. As I explained already, they never called me back, and they still didn't so far. So after more than 3 weeks. I have been called, however, by the Swiss embassy in Den Haag, which is responsible for the consular protection of citizens living in the Benelux. But without telling me what Switzerland wants to do. I mean, she gave me just the ambassador gave me a few links to the EU sanctions and things like this. She called me just twice, and that's it. So from the Swiss government, I don't know exactly what they want to do, if they want to do something. From the Swiss citizens, I see a lot of people who have written letters. They are making petitions. They are collecting signatures to address the Swiss Federal Council and the Minister of Foreign Affairs in order to prompt them to act on my case. So I don't know how powerful is the Swiss government in that particular case. But there will be, in the European Union, in Switzerland, political action to try to have me lifted from the sanction list. Beyond this, there is a more fundamental work to be done, and what you do, I think, is extremely useful. I mean, you and other channels like yours are extremely useful, because I think this work of advocacy is in fact the way to address people. You see, my case in France, for instance, although I'm French speaker, almost nobody knows it, because the French media have been extremely silent on this. And the French media, they are exactly like during the German occupation. They tell what the government tells them to do. So that's all. So they are silent if the government tell them to be silent. And that's exactly what happens with my case. In fact, I have family living in France. They were not even aware of my case.
How sad. Really sad, the whole thing. Jacques, very last thing. People who want to somehow support you, I mean, since all of your accounts were frozen and so on, it's really hard to probably wire you something. But is there any way people who really want to do something for you, should they contact you? What should they do?
Oh, as far as I know, there is no currently a committee to be created, or is in the process of being created in Switzerland, that will collect not just signature but also money for the support of my case. I'm not exactly aware where the project stands at this stage. Of course, it could not move so much as fast as we wanted during the holiday season. Now it will start. So in the coming days, I'll probably get more information about this. But if some money can be collected, it can only be collected in non-EU countries. So it can be collected in North America. And I receive a lot of offers from people in Canada, in the US, and of course in Switzerland. And people will probably, I mean, most probably Switzerland will be the place where this money will be collected.
Okay.
Again, I am not aware of all the details because this is done by people. I'm not even, I shouldn't even be aware of that, because according to the EU rules, nobody is allowed to provide me with any resource, whatever the word resource means.
Right.
So people are not allowed to provide me a resource. I mean, even those who are providing me with food, well, I assume that basic food for basic needs will not be considered as a punishable action or a criminal case, but providing me with resources, most probably financial resources, wiring. I mean, they cannot wire me no money because my accounts are blocked, but providing me with money would be then a criminal case for those people.
Okay,
So
sorry, just
in Switzerland, I will keep you I will keep you informed about the where this money will be collected. It will be in Switzerland, but I will give you the address and the proper contacts.
yeah, for everybody listening, please check the description box below. Once I get the updates, I will put it also there, and we will do another interview once once this is all together, and I will post it in other places. Just look out for it. And again, Jacques Baud is not the only one. There's Nathalie Yamp, there's Hussein Dogru, there's other people, there's all the people who still might be put on this list. It's not about just one person, it's about the rule of law itself. So Jacques Baud, thank you very much for fighting this fight.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for all your efforts, for you and all those who support my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques.